Hi, this is Dan. Today we're going to be talking about what has been happening with the CW and its purchase by Nexstar. This is one of the big stories that is hitting Hollywood right now. And there is also a lot of misinformation, especially coming out of some of the trade papers, that's actually surprising to me because I come from the world of first-run syndication. So I understand exactly what Nexstar is in terms of the whole television firmament. And it seems like in the past 20 years that much of the reportage that's going on about what happens in the world of terrestrial television stations has been ignored to the point where people don't even understand the basic business premises anymore. But needless to say, this is probably one of the more advantageous purchases. And while it looks very odd that the company would be practically given the CW on the basis of them just assuming the $100 million in debt, there's also another very, very important reason why this merger makes sense. And that is that Nexstar is the largest independent group of stations. It is the largest station group in the United States right now. And in fact, it is an affiliate for every one of the networks. So it has a very, very strong base there. Now, the CEO got into a little bit of a kerfluffle when he made the comment that well, he's going to change the kind of programming they make and figure more into who the core viewership of the channel is. And the truth is, the core viewership of the channel, which Perry Sook said was primarily people who are 58 plus, is actually the truth. I know that that's very hard for a lot of people to take when you think of the kind of programming that the CW generally provides. But the truth is that terrestrial broadcasting and even basic cable and premium cable is an old person's game. Most young people very seldom really watch linear TV at all. And if they do, they're usually watching it through an aggregator, whether it be Netflix or YouTube or whatever, Hulu. But they're very seldom looking at it in the traditional sense. But, and this is a problem that Hollywood tends to have, and that is that rather than looking at that as, well, we just have to get the young viewers back, what Sook is saying is we're going to take the audience that we have and build on it. There have been numerous success stories of basic cable stations. Note I said basic because we're going to, for the moment, put aside the blingy stations like HBO Max and Disney Plus and Netflix and all of that. Because but look at basic cable. What was one of the biggest things that basic cable launched? Basic cable, with its installed base of primarily older people, was able to transform AMC. And how did they transform AMC? AMC, if people have a memory that goes back this far, used to be the station that would show a lot of old movies, particularly 20th Century Fox movies. So if you wanted to see Coney Island, you could generally find it there at some point. But starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, they decided to pivot and create some original programming. Their initial forays into that were largely unsuccessful, such as the studio and some others. But they hit on pay dirt when they started doing Mad Men. And why was Mad Men ingenious? Because AMC understood that it is very, very dangerous to rebrand your channel. They had already seen what MTV had done when it's called MTV, but it never shows music videos anymore. And now it's a network with a name that has a lot of value, but the name does not reflect what it shows. So what they did is they found a compromise, and that is they took a look at the content of the movies that they were making or they were showing, and they took that content and they adapted it. And the result was Mad Men. Because what is Mad Men in effect but a Doris Day Rock Hudson movie that for some reason is done far more dramatically and takes into a lot of the considerations that we now have politically about the role of women in the workforce and all of that. So it updated it and still made it relevant. And that's because they understood that their primary viewers were older people. And if they just completely shifted gears, they would lose everything. But look what happened in the process. Younger people started watching these shows and quite frankly were surprised, because if they had ever watched old AMC content, would have probably been thinking, oh my God, my poor grandparents or great grandparents, they grew up in this world where it was so repressive and all of that. But no, you actually see what was going on behind the scenes. And in the process of doing that, you now had a unique combination of younger people watching the show as well as the older people. The older people understood the context and appreciated the remaking of familiar stories. And we all know that this became even bigger with Breaking Bad. Because what is Breaking Bad other than a variation on the movies that came right after the fall of censorship? And we saw a greater amorality. We had movies made about anti-heroes, particularly something like Bonnie and Clyde or The Getaway. And Breaking Bad does that. It takes someone who is really a nefarious character, even though he has, this nice backstory, and makes them a hero so that we are on that person's side. And of course, we have Walking Dead, which is Night of the Living Dead. So AMC took its older audience and created shows that appealed to that audience and then went younger. This is what I believe that Perry Sook is planning to do, because what he's doing is he's looking at the US landscape, because remember, he also has ownership in other businesses that do reruns. So he sees the incredible numbers that are coming in from old legacy content that still has viewership, and even more importantly, has younger viewership. That might not be in phenomenal numbers, but it doesn't matter because you have programming that is cheap. So even if the numbers aren't huge, you are still living in the world of profit. And he says that he wants to do programming that appeals to that group. Note, he's not saying that it's only going to appeal to that group. And I think that he has probably looked at the landscape and said, there is an opportunity here. There is an opportunity here to create something where right now there is nothing. What are some of the genres that show up on the My TV network and things like that that aren't being made by anyone right now? Well, a very obvious example is light detective stories. Now, light detective stories are the kind that Aaron Spelling used to make. And for those who are old enough, you remember Charlie's Angels in Vegas and Heart to Heart and programs like that. Those were light detective. They weren't necessarily 100% believable. They did not have the hard edge that, let's say, a Kojak or an NYPD Blue or a Hill Street Blues or any of those had, or a Law and Order. No, these were shows that were kind of funny and kind of quirky, kind of Columbo, kind of Magnum PI and all of that. And that is actually, again, Sense Castle is a genre that is almost missing entirely. The other thing that's missing is a traditional family type 1 hour drama. Now, this is a dirty little secret, but the WB's biggest show was not Smallville, was not Buffy, was not any of that. Their biggest show in terms of households using televisions, and I know everyone goes, oh, the households using televisions are always going to skew. Oh, of course. But their #1 show was actually Seventh Heaven, and that's why that show remained on the air. And you'll notice that WB was very cautious about never letting that fact out there to the general public. It was always about the younger skewing shows. But the truth was that the Altacocker shows were the ones that brought in the numbers. Let's go back again to say that first run syndication in the early 90s, when I was in the very early stages of my career, and I got the opportunity to work on Baywatch for those 11 years as an executive, I actually saw how first run syndication could work, because shows like Baywatch, Hercules, and Xena created a whole new model of making programs. And that was that you would make a program that would be funded entirely out of Europe. And that in turn would back into the US, where the US was a profit center, and those shows were never deficited. Baywatch was in profit from the very moment it aired for the first time in the United States. And that is the beauty of the first run syndication model. The first run syndication model was also very cheap. And so that's why when you look at programs like Baywatch and like Xena and Hercules, and actually Star Trek The Next Generation began in first run syndication. It was on the success of that UPN decided to build a network. So yeah, how many people realize that? And what these shows did is they proved that there was a big audience out there that was willing to watch the kind of programming the network wasn't doing. Because think about when Star Trek The Next Generation and Baywatch first launched. Now, admittedly, there was already a first run syndication original programming model that included things like What's Happening and The New Gidget and other things that no one remembers. But what was interesting about it is most network programming was very dour. You had as one of the #1 sitcoms, Roseanne, which was like All in the Family, very bleak view. It was funny, but it was also very bleak. You had a new business model enter the picture, and that business model was from Rupert Murdoch's very daring decision to try to launch a fourth network, which was Fox. And what Rupert Murdoch realized that was Fox was not covered in 90% of the country. Therefore, its standards and practices requirements were different. It didn't require quite the stringency that a network would. So it could do far more edgy programming, like a 21 Jump Street or an X-Files or an Alien Nation or any number of shows like In Living Color that were appealing to a slightly different audience. And this would reach its peak in things like Married with Children and The Simpsons, which were rather transgressive programming. And so in addition to the fact that most networking program was dour with the very dark detective shows, the Law and Orders and the NYPD Blues and the X-Files and all of that, there was this perception that you needed something lighter, something goofy, something that you could turn your brain off, something that was blue skies. And that's what worked. What Baywatch, Xena, Hercules, Star Trek, all of those did is they opened up the international market to actually being interested in American programming. Prior to that point, American programming on television was considered so America-specific that it had no overseas market. There were a couple of shows that would go overseas and would do okay, especially the bright nighttime soap operas like a Dallas or a Dynasty. But by and large, most American programs were shut out. This would change with those shows and thereby bring about a different market. And I believe what the CW is planning to do is to do that kind of more broad, more silly programming-based appeal where you can turn off your brain. Let's face it, most network shows today, most premium shows are nihilistic. This is not me criticizing them, because there's much greater content being made today than at any other point in television history. And actually, you can even extend that into motion picture history as well. We have a real blessings and wealth of fantastic content worldwide that's right at our fingertips, and we're able to enjoy it. But we have forgotten that sometimes you just want a show that you don't really have to devote your facilities to completely paying attention to, especially when so many of the programs that are being done right now on the premium level have spiraling budgets. And these spiraling budgets are there to give the shows a unique and almost cinematic look, supposedly because we now have 4K TVs, whatever. But the truth is, they're still not watched generally under ideal conditions. In fact, more than 50% of viewers of streaming content are watching it at best on their computers or on their cell phones at worst. So a lot of that production bling is gone. Plus, how many times are you half watching something, just like an old game show or an old soap opera? You're only half watching it while you're doing something else. You're only using one sense. So therefore, a lot of that nice production is being wasted. And in the process, your entire programming diet is costing a lot of money for a very little return. What Zaslav at Warner Brothers Discovery and what Bob Chapek and now what Sook are trying to do is bring that cost down and understand who your real viewers are, why they watch. Remember, television is inviting you into their homes. So it's like having a friend over. Sometimes the friend's annoying, right? That's a bad episode, but you always have them coming a lot. And that, again, goes back to what we have now is we have a business model that's based on quality over quantity. And while I know we've been told that our whole lives, it's not really true. Sometimes your quality can only come about through a vast amount of quantity, and that was the old traditional TV model. A problem is a lot of the business models are not coming out of show business, they're coming out of other markets. They're coming out of other disciplines which do not relate to show business. So let's get into some of the reasons why station ownership, which many people perceived to not be valuable, is indeed. The number one is that terrestrial stations still have an enormous viewership of people who don't have streaming or cable. And I know it comes as an eternal shock to people who live in big cities that there is such a thing as someone who doesn't have broadband cable. But there are tons of people who don't have it. And moreover, there's tons of people who don't want it. And that is what the terrestrial stations continue to address. And so that is a market that has been largely ignored, but it is still huge. Trust me, Sook did not get the payday he is making, which is actually very competitive with what Chapek is making and with what each of the guys who founded Netflix individually are making. So this is not a joke of a guy. He's not being paid that kind of money because he doesn't know what he's doing. In spite of all the talk we hear of linear TV being dead, the bottom line is the ad dollars are still going there predominantly. Almost half of the money Disney made at the last upfronts came from ABC alone. The other half came from a combination of the ESPNs and everything else, and the promise of what Disney Plus with advertising will have. But the linear TV is still the biggest game in town, and that isn't changing yet, especially because linear television is the home of sports, and sports is the #1 programming that you can get males to watch. So there's still a lot of life left in the old beast, and people need to go after all money, not just say, this is fun money, so I'm only going to focus on that. That's boring. That's old school. That's embarrassing for me to have on my resume. Yes, I had one of my bosses, be determined to cancel Baywatch because he would go to parties and people would make fun of him for working on a show. And I was like, it's paying your paycheck. What are you doing? So, you know, there's that. So you go where the money is. And that's what he's trying to do. And the business model that first run syndication lives under is a complicated one, admittedly. And I'll do a recording at some point that explains how that works. But suffice to say, there is room for potential, and people who are mocking this transaction, and especially if they're coming from the industry press, are merely showing their ignorance in the field that they're paid to.
「友達の結婚式」いつも次は僕の番だと思うんだけど気分上々会いに行くか。